Hello, FlipTech 2020. I'm Michael Ralph, and we're going to be talking about connections to research here in this virtual remote session that we're going to share together. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an educator. I taught high school biology for a number of years here in the Kansas City metro area. Eventually, I moved to a local university where I taught secondary STEM teacher prep. My primary responsibility there was teaching a course called Research Methods, where a mixture of STEM majors would come together to design, develop, and implement their own investigations and experiments over the course of the semester. And it was a lot of fun. These days, I work at Gould Evans Education as an in-house researcher, where my specializations are in issues of education practice, education measurement, and interactions between space and people. Now, all of that's my day job. I also do some things for fun. I'm the father of twin 2-year-olds, and they are a couple of handfuls. I also like to play volleyball, I tinker in my workshop, and I enjoy a good game with friends. One more hobby that I have is that I run an education podcast with a close friend and former coworker of mine. Lawrence Woodruff and I host 2 Pint PLC, which is a podcast during which we get together in a casual, personal setting to talk about education research. We started this show because when we worked together, we really appreciated how we had the opportunity to challenge each other as we considered how ongoing research might shape our classroom practice. So when we parted ways as coworkers, we committed to getting together again in a more relaxed, informal setting where we could enjoy each other's company, drink a beer, and reflect on how the things we were reading in research and current events might shape the way we think about our practice together. Now, what I've learned in that time is that education research is for everyone. Teaching is a profession, which means as a society, we are still learning and coming to understand what it means to learn, to think, and to teach. So if we're going to stay connected to that broadening frontier, if we're going to stay cutting edge in what we do in our practice, we have to maintain a connection to that developing research base. So as we think about what that means for ourselves as practitioners, I want to start by acknowledging a couple of barriers that we face to having a research connection as practitioners. Now, first off, I have to acknowledge scholarly papers can feel intimidating, bordering on unwelcoming sometimes. They're presented in sometimes very formal environments. They use technical jargon and language that may not be understandable or familiar to folks who focus on classroom practice. I also have to acknowledge that sometimes authors don't look like you and may not share your life experience. And many of the papers are behind paywalls that make them difficult to access for folks who don't have a connection to subscription-bearing libraries. And a lot of those problems are problems for the education research community to deal with. We have to acknowledge those and find ways to reduce their impact on readership. There's also the problem of just reading. A lot of research papers are long. If we're reading 20, 30, or more pages to get through one article, and those pages are full of dense descriptions and technical diagrams, it can just be a daunting task to get through the reading, especially if we're not always sure that that particular research article is going to impact or change what we do in the classroom. It can be a little bit disheartening to spend several hours trying to understand a study just to realize this isn't really about what I needed it to be about. And so I need to acknowledge that those can be some barriers. I suspect most of you are not going to argue that we shouldn't be connected to research. So instead, I want to spend our time together thinking about what are some good, healthy habits we can build in our day-to-day process to have a better connection to research in manageable, sustainable ways. Welcome back. So I want to share 5 suggestions for habits that you can build into your daily routine that gives you a current connection to education research in a manageable way. And here they are. Let's start with the first. Follow the link. Now, what does that mean? There's a lot of material out there from practitioners and authors and other folks in the education world providing suggestions and input for you to make your classroom practice better. And all of that's great. But let's take a look at an example of how they can connect back to the research in a way that lets you get the information directly from the researchers themselves. Let's take a look at an example of an article that I wrote recently. Here's a piece that I published with Edutopia not too long ago. Now in it, I'm combining the findings of some researchers on online instruction with my perspective as a practitioner, and I provide some suggestions that I hope are useful to classroom teachers. And if you find them useful, that's fantastic. But if you are finding it to be something that you think you want to use, I have a suggestion. Look closely on that piece that's connected to research, and you'll find a reference or some sort of connection back to the original study itself. Now, if this is something you think you want to be using, I suggest you follow the link or give that link a click to take a look at the material being created by the authors themselves. Now, in this scenario, I'm suggesting that you have the perspective of a practitioner or a consultant or somebody else who's written the blog post, and you can combine that with the richness and the context of the researchers themselves to make sure that you're implementing things in your classroom that are both useful and closely tied to the findings of what the researchers are seeing in their study. All this together makes for a richer application, and this technique makes sure that the papers you're choosing to read are really likely to be relevant to your classroom practice because you've got the early blog post to tell you kind of the overall theme of what you're about to read. Now, this brings us to the second point. If you click that link, you're going to be looking at a piece of research writing. That's a paper, and length can be a problem. So let's get to my second suggestion, which is check the figures. So in this scenario, if you've read a blog post, or maybe you're just skimming through an article list and you see an abstract, which is the short summary of the paper right at the beginning, and it says that it's something that you maybe want to reading. If you're going to take a look at that paper, you don't just read it like a novel, you don't just dive into the first section and start reading from start to finish. My suggestion to you is jump down to the middle of the paper and check the figures. These things are tables, these things are graphs, these things are illustrations that give you the overall findings of the paper in a really quick to digest format that give you an even better sense of whether diving into the full piece of writing is going to be something you want to spend your time doing. So here's an example from the online research that I wrote the blog post about. So if you scan down to about halfway, you can see that this table lays out some of the major themes that emerged from their study and which commenters provided those themes to them in their initial batch of interviews. And so this lets me see how often are these things showing up and what are the themes in the first place. So if I see something that I maybe want to think more about in my classroom or on my remote implementation of my learning platform, then I can look more closely at the writing of that paper. So this gives me a chance to jump really quickly, see what it's about, and decide if I want to invest any further in my reading for this instance. Let's take a look at another example. Here's an article from another discussion I was having with a colleague about note-taking practices and which kinds of environments have which impacts on note-taking processes. Now you can see from this graph that they're pretty different and they change across environments. And so if you're looking at this and thinking to yourself, well, this might be something that shapes how I approach note-taking in the coming semester, then you can pull open this paper and read more closely about what this graph means. What are the different environments they examined and what were the details of those environments? Those differences look really big and they look like they change as the environments change, but are those changes something that I really want to use to affect how I approach learning, or are those changes something that isn't really applicable to my kind of an environment? The graph tells you the general way that they change, and if you think that might be something useful to you, you can take a closer look at it. Let's keep going. The third one is to get surprised. Now, the first two examples were all about material that we were choosing to read and addressing problems that we had already identified that we wanted to address. But what about the opportunity to find something that we didn't know we wanted to read or a problem that we hadn't identified for ourselves yet? This is the instance where it's worth taking some time to give yourself an opportunity to be surprised. To use a quote that I've enjoyed referencing before, if you ask me what I want, I'd have said faster horse. This is a quote often attributed to Henry Ford. It's not by him, but it's basically a reference to in the development of the automobile, had you asked people what they wanted, they would have just wanted faster horses, which was the thing they already knew they were using for transportation. But to really disrupt what was going on and to realize an exciting new opportunity, we had to get outside of the current paradigm for what was possible, which is automobiles. So in this case, spending some time when you're able to make yourself available for new, exciting, disruptive research is time well spent. Let me make a suggestion for how I do it. This is taken from a tool called Feedly. This is something that works in a browser or on your mobile device that lets you aggregate news stories and headlines from RSS feeds. And what that means is lots of websites, but also research journals, put out new articles and new headlines and issues of news on a feeder that can be pulled into something that aggregates lots of them together into a quick, digestible format. Here's what mine looks like. So I've identified the RSS feed of a handful of education journals that I want to follow. And when I have time every week or every month or whenever I'm available for a few minutes, I can skim a list of lots of headlines from lots of different research sources to find if there are titles or maybe short descriptions that resonate with me, that suggest that maybe that's something I should take a closer look at. Here's an example. As I was skimming my biology research feed, I found a study from a couple of days ago that related to Nature Genetics and their response to the ongoing discussions of racism here in the United States and abroad. And I realized that genetics is absolutely a topic that I may want to put in my classroom so that we can have a discussion about the role that genetics and genetics research has played in institutional and systemic racism over the course of our country's history. This is just one example of I hadn't chosen to go to Nature Genetics to look for their statement on racism and the status quo. But once I see it, I realize that, yeah, that could be a valuable addition to my classroom. One more way to make yourself available to be surprised is to know the people. And this is a reminder that researchers walk among us. They're people who live in our communities and who are working in the workspaces just down the street from our own. And they're trying to communicate with all of us. They're trying to make their work known, and they're trying to connect with us to make their own research more effective. And I want to suggest that it's worth your time incorporating connecting with researchers in the fields that matter to you into your broader professional network. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, if I haven't gotten started, how do I find the researchers who I may want to connect with in my professional learning network, or maybe just in my regional network of people with whom I have conversations? Well, if you're on Twitter or some of the other social network spaces, this is a good opportunity for you to leverage the professional organizations that bring researchers and practitioners together. Here's an example of the Twitter account associated with the American Educational Research Association, or ERA. They have lots and lots of followers. So if you want to get started looking for researchers in particular areas of education, I would pop open their list of followers and you can start to skim down the list. And in all of those bios, you're going to see lots and lots of instances where people are telling you what their areas of research may be. So you could start to click the follow button on people who work in education policy, or maybe people who work in cognitive science, or any of the other subdisciplines that may suggest that they want to be following these professional organizations. From there, you can see who are they following, whose tweets do they retweet, and you can slowly build into your professional learning network the people who are doing the research, which can then bring to your attention all the exciting work that they're creating. And I want to point out, they're not just making research articles, but also in many cases, they're trying to engage with the community. They want to be providing things like professional development and instructional resources. Here's an example from a regional researcher. They work for the Kansas Geological Survey. These are a couple of geologists, Dr. Blair Snyder and Layla Joyce Seals, and they've created a series of YouTube videos that can be used in our current remote teaching environment. And I know that lots of folks across the country and even around the world are going to have folks working in your area associated with your regional professional organizations who are trying to be more connected to practitioners in the classroom. So make yourself available to connecting with those people because they make really great stuff and it can enrich the experience of your students. We've come to my last suggestion for the day, and this one is to normalize the struggle. This one is really about modeling the process, because what we ask of our students in our classroom is that they engage with uncomfortable and challenging scenarios to try to get better at what they do. And a really powerful way to show them that what they're experiencing as they struggle and as they fail and try again is that that's a normal process. And so engaging with the research that challenges us as practitioners is a good way to show them how we experience the same process in which we're asking them to engage. So what I suggest to you is show them that you're taking a look at research, whether it be education research or maybe something that's in your discipline. Show them that what you're thinking about and be completely transparent about what you're experiencing and what you're thinking. Acknowledge what you know and what you don't know. Acknowledge the emotions that you're feeling as you're trying to understand it. It doesn't have to be a polished product. In fact, showing them that it isn't can be all the more valuable in helping them build the process skills of becoming research literate themselves. One good example is sharing one of those biology papers that I described, and we might read it together as a class. Now, we're not going to read the entire paper, but we might read the abstract or maybe an extracted section from their introduction or from their results. And during the first hours of the day, we might read it and take a look at one of their figures, and we might discuss, what do you think this means? And when they ask me, well, what does it mean? I'd say, I'm not totally sure yet. Here's what I'm looking at. Here's what I don't understand yet. What do you think about this? And by the fifth time I've done that day, I might know a little bit more about it. But being open about my process of still coming to understand that paper makes it more of a community process as we struggle through understanding something, rather than me dictating to them that they should be understanding something that is challenging and difficult. It shows that we all experience those things as we go through the process of getting better together. It's especially useful when I say, I really don't know what this means, and I feel frustrated because I'm sure that vocabulary that I've seen before, I'm sure that I sat in a workshop a year ago that described that, and I feel frustrated and a little bit tired trying to remember all of that right now. Your students will appreciate that openness and feel a connection that they're not the only ones who feel those things. Let me show you an example of how we did that in the higher education world. In that research methods class I described, this note-taking example is taken from an instance when I was teaching with a colleague, and we had a disagreement about how we were going to support the students in our class as they took notes during the course of our work together. And we acknowledged that disagreement in front of our students. We went back and we searched for research that might be relevant to that question, and this was the paper that we found. So then we blocked out an entire day where the students came in and were seated, and we distributed this paper. And my colleague and I both said, we've been reading this paper, trying to make a decision about how we approach notes in this class. Let's take a look at this research together and decide what do we think the best course of action might be. And it wasn't about declaring a winner. It wasn't about who's right or wrong. It was about engaging with material that might help us all make a more informed decision. And what was really gratifying about the situation was that we found that both my colleague and I had valuable points. We both walked away better understanding that phenomenon, and our students got to participate in the process of crafting our learning environment along with the instructors. And so we all felt empowered for how we were going to proceed in learning the rest of that semester. So inviting them into that discussion made them contributors and showed them how we proceed as professionals when we encounter instances where it's not 100% clear how we should proceed. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you'll join me as we have a conversation about these suggestions and more of the challenges that you may face or that you've been thinking about as you try to incorporate more research into your practice and into your classroom. So please come join me and we'll have a conversation next week, or feel free to reach out to me at either of these contact opportunities if you're watching this sometime in the future. Thanks for tuning in. Discuss research.